welcome to my channel, Angie the ENTJ. Please be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and click on the notifications bell so that you'll know whenever I upload any new content. I was listening in on a live yesterday with Supreme of the West 4B movement, and other people came up on the panel as well. I was not able to call in because I had a class to attend at the time. However, I would occasionally listen in and comment, and she asked me to screenshot a particular comment that I made where I posted that basically within about a year's time, maybe less, the males, or basically the patriarchy, primarily males, but some women too, females, because they're not woman enough to be, I don't know what else to call them, so whatever. You know, they're going to switch it up and act like they were not a part of the manosphere, that they had nothing to do with the red pill. And I also added that they don't want to be traditional. So beyond me seeing the same behavior during the hijacking of the natural hair movement more than 25 years ago, I also understand that this behavior of being violent and then all of a sudden changing personalities into a loving, romantic, benevolent person is a common tactic used by abusers within their cycle of violence. Although abuse is not gendered, it is predominantly perpetuated by men. This is the guy, for an example, who will berate his girlfriend or beat her up, which is like the violent phase of the abuse cycle, this violent outburst. Now, what generally happens then afterwards, the situation begins to enter the honeymoon phase. This is what will happen whether or not the girlfriend or ex-girlfriend stays with him. You know, he'll be engaging in behaviors like calling her, sending her cards, offering her money, paying her more attention, sending flowers, apologizing, and so forth. All of this in an effort to get back with her. This is also the time when some women, even if they have left the guy and now they see like he's struggling, he's homeless, this is the time when they'll go into the self-talk of saying, okay, I think he's learned his lesson. You know, I'd rather have my family together. It's better that my child has his father around. My son needs his father. You know, they'll do this self-sabotaging self-talk, and they will allow that brute back into their lives. And when he's back in, there's typically a period of calm, like what we see with the abuse cycle. And then the next thing you know, he's back at it again with his own unique brand of bullcrap, whatever that may be. And then the arguments begin. This is a part of the abuse cycle that is the tension building up, you know, that phase. So that will continue to happen, and then it will get to a point where it's back to the violent outburst. And usually this time, especially after he's left and come back, that violent outburst is more severe than before. Because this is unfortunately is a time that when you will hear that the dude just offed his wife or baby mama, because you see, listen, the woman kicked him out before and then she took him back in, right? Because that may have been the first time that she kicked him out. So he knows that she's not playing. So this time he knows that when she kicks him out, there's no coming back to her. So he uses unalivement or any other type of permanent sabotage as a way to secure a permanent source of food, shelter, and clothing for the rest of his life in the Gray Bar Motel, aka prison. Or he's just so narcissistic, he can't imagine life, you know, like that. So he takes himself out too. Anything to avoid accountability. So with that understanding, when observing the abuse cycle, I can see the rise of the 4B movement right about here. We've been violated for a while. We are the pink sheep of the society. You know how like they say the scapegoat and the black sheep? Okay, we're the pink sheep of the society. And we, the pink sheep of the society, have said that we're not going to take it anymore. And as a collective, are kicking the men out on a social level. So no different than the individual, we're going to see something socially, and I feel that this is a time to be critically aware of it and also to understand how to manage it on a larger scale. Because it will come to a point where the patriarchy will begin to use the honeymoon phase tactics of handing out rights, of giving a few breadcrumbs like more affordable health care and more affordable housing and so forth, just to get us as a collective back into the calm phase. This is because the calm phase gives them more time to develop their backup plan for oppressing us all over again, with the goal of it being more effective. That's because they are brutes who lack the capacity to use wisdom to resolve conflicts. And yes, obligatory, not all men. I know that individually, not every single man walking around is a brute. There are even some who agree with the West 4B movement. Let's not focus on the exception. Let's focus on the norm, because the norm is what got us here. Okay? Because the norm is who prefers to use brutality like the Romans did during the time of the Roman civilization, which is part of the reason why they went extinct. So I have some suggestions on how we should manage the honeymoon phase that they will certainly attempt to throw in our direction. However, I have to first do a bit of a history dive so that you can see it from my ENTJ standpoint. The first thing that you need to understand is that we've been here before as a society. I feel that we're towards the end of the violent phase illustrated in the cycle of violence, or the cycle of abuse. Many will think that the rise of the West 4B movement is an exclusive response to the overturning of Roe versus Wade, along with the fact that 65,000 women roughly have been R-worded in this nation and are being forced to bear the children of violent R-wording criminals. So the West 4B movement, from my observation, is the absolute correct response of being women who have been turned into the scapegoat, the black sheep, or rather the pink sheep of the U.S. society. So let's go ahead and do this history dive. First, there was Brown versus the Board of Education. That was like, 1954, which removed segregation from the schools. This happened around the violent phase of the society. Afterwards was the Civil Rights era, which included the March on Washington during the 60s and, the Civil Rights Movement era in general during the 70s. Also, along this time was the assassination of JFK, John F. Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, and add some Vietnam War protests to it with a little bit of Watergate. So that was around this time. From my perspective, all of this happened during a violence phase within our social abuse cycle. So with a ton of young people protesting, the baby boomers, and going against the brainwashed and self-sabotaging version of mainstream culture at the time, concessions began to be made. The Civil Rights Act was passed, abortion rights, Roe v. Wade were made constitutional, particularly with women. This was the phase where the collective can now get a credit card without their husband's permission, can open a bank account within their own names, advances in affirmative action, which enabled women, and as well as other people, to work jobs that earn higher incomes, such as industrial jobs, without facing legal discrimination. So now we're in the honeymoon phase. When the Vietnam War ends, President Jimmy Carter establishes Habitat for Humanity. Things are humming along fine. And then President Ronald Reagan was voted into office. Now, the reason why I pointed it out, I tried to avoid naming presidents because, for those that don't know, I'm not red, I'm not blue, I'm not liberal, I'm not conservative, I'm purple, and I'm center, okay? So I didn't want to appear as if I'm trying to rile up anything, any disagreement between the two, because it's never ending. But the reason why I had to mention President Ronald Reagan is because when he was voted into office, he brought Reaganomics and the tax cuts that came along with it. And it's important to note that. Also, this was during a time when the savings and loan crisis happened, And you can research that at any time. But just to give a brief synopsis, the savings and loans crisis made the average American who was affected by it, it made them upside down in their home. Or in other words, they owed more on their home than what it was worth. So can you imagine, you put your house up for sale, and let's just say that your house is worth $100,000, and you sell it for $100,000, but you owe $150,000 on it. So that's the kind of situation many Americans were in during the savings and loans crisis, which was a housing crisis in and of itself. So there was a bit of a house crisis back then, much like we're in a housing crisis right now. Moving along in this honeymoon phase, we saw the end of the Cold War, right? Then that's when we entered the calm phase, where the U.S. economy was corrected. Not only that, it began to have a surplus. At that time, jobs were abundant. Everything was relatively affordable. This was a time when monthly mortgage payments for a house were actually cheaper than paying rent for an apartment. So it was cheaper to go out and buy a house than it was to stay in an apartment and rent. And that's what many Americans did during the time when the economy was in a surplus. Okay. This is also a time when, although gas prices were increasing, it was still affordable. This is during the good old days, okay, of flying. When I showed up to catch a flight from Chicago's Midway Airport and boarded the plane within 20 minutes of takeoff. You can't do that now. There's no way. So this was in the calm phase of the social abuse cycle. Then came 9/11. Then came the Afghan war. We didn't realize that it was going to be 20 years long at that point in time, but it was there. So we were still in the calm phase because although we're losing money, we're not in an economic deficit just yet. So things appear to be manageable, right? Except those of us who kind of know economics, one thing we know is that the number one thing you can do to jack up a nation's economy is to go to war. Look at Ukraine. Before and after pictures, on your own. They were doing okay until they had to fight off Putin's attempt to strong arm access to a warm water port. I think it's pronounced Sevastopol. Forgive me if I mispronounced it. But just a bit of FYI. A warm water port is a place where ships can come to all year long without the threat of forming sea ice. And that sea ice damages ships. So warm water ports means that, you can constantly trade throughout the year. Whereas if you're in a port that has sea ice, it can affect it. It can affect your economy. So going back to the history dive versus the cycle of abuse, the U.S. begins to develop a deficit as a result of going to war. And this begins the tension buildup phase in the social abuse cycle. So remember, American people generally were calm after a couple of decades of relative stability when in 2008, the housing bubble burst, much like what happened with the savings and loan crisis that occurred back in the 80s. So now housing crisis is back on the menu, and you notice that these wars kind of precede the housing crisis, right? Then we're still in the tension building phase when the reality of having a surplus of over 70 million men on the planet, 50 million of whom are now currently adults, when that reality now enters the dating pool. And rather than understand this outcome as nothing more than the find out phase of what happens when femicide, domestic violence, female selective infanticide, witch hunts, and basically not valuing women, when that is normalized in a society and that meets the dating pool, rather than accept that reality. The red pill manosphere MGTOW movements is patriarchy's delusional attempt to once again try to fit the round peg into the square hole.
And up next, a cylinder.
The circle.
I think that goes in
the circle.
The square hole. Now,
they have a habit of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, but I digress. So going back to the social abuse cycle, this is a point where unexpectedly the pandemic hits. And now everything is exposed. Everything. There's no hiding it anymore. Women working from home have to also juggle caring for their children while working because everything is closed, including daycare. This is the collective of women who got to see firsthand what happens when they're cooped up in the house day in and day out with their husbands or significant others. Many of them got to see just how much they are expected to handle in terms of the uncompensated labor of the home, as well as bringing in income to help out with the finances of said home while still setting up the dinner table to serve a meal like waitstaff to the family, who doesn't earn any tips, by the way. Now, after all of this, that's when they decide to overturn Roe versus Wade, which in and of itself is an act of violence. And the proof lies in that of the 10-year-old girl who was found pregnant in Ohio, and it made national news at the time of why abortion access was necessary. Thankfully, she was able to make it into the neighboring state to have the procedure done so that a 10-year-old girl doesn't have to suffer the fate of giving birth to a child that was conceived by a 27-year-old man who had R-worded her. So here we are at the rise of the West 4B movement, which, if we were to go back about 60 years ago, this is around the time when, the time in the social abuse cycle, as it's being illustrated, I should say. This is around the time when women were mythically burning their bras. But it was more about tossing the things that oppressed them into the trash can of freedom, which included unreasonable beauty standards and unreasonable expectations that, for instance, someone with a degree from MIT should center her life around how well she mops her floor in her home. Now think about it. It was only 40 to 50 years prior to the women's rights movement that women's suffrage took place, granting women the right to vote. So women's rights movement 1960-ish, women's suffrage 1920-ish. So the difference between that is like 40 years, right? So it's safe to say that certainly during the mythical bra burning era of the women's rights movements, women were saying, hey, it was just only about 40 to 50 years ago that our mothers and our grandmothers gained the right to vote. And here we are in 2024, and here's how we sound, okay? Hey, it was only 50 years ago, roughly, when our mothers and grandmothers gained the right to have their credit cards in their own name and their own checking accounts without needing their husband's permission, okay? So I had to show that, and thank you for being patient while I did that, because it helps you to understand the big picture. This is what I suggest so that we don't have younger women sounding like scratch records from the women's liberations movement of the past. Okay? First off, set the standards in such a way to see tangible results. Right now, there is a housing crisis. There is an economic deficit that is looming. Inflation is too high, and food insecurity is the norm for some families. Everything is expensive, including the dwindling options of daycare and access to life-saving health care. That will put you in debt for the rest of your life, for some people. What I suggest is that when they want to switch up, tell them that they have to make the United States, in terms of the benefits to its citizens, they have to make it look like Finland. I prefer Monaco, but we can start with Finland because Finland is considered the happiest place on the planet for the 7th year in a row, according to the World Happiness Report. Finland as a nation values its citizens and has a huge social safety net for them. And no, I am not promoting communism. Finland is not a communist or a socialist nation. Finland, in its own time, no different than where the U.S. is right now, went through a bass-awkward period where their maternal mortality rates were high and their infant mortality rates were around 90%. Yep, you heard it right. About 90%. And people were being unalived by those harsh cold winters while living in the streets beneath bridges. So Finland got their heads out of their behinds and realized that in order to work on these societal issues, the people needed stability in the form of housing and access to services such as healthcare. They needed to have education so that they can pursue opportunities to earn income, so on and so forth. This is why I say to counter any attempt to switch this situation into the honeymoon phase with, quote, make us look like Finland. Okay? Make us, the U.S., the U and the S in the U.S., make us look like Finland. This means build the housing, fix our crumbling infrastructure, and we don't want to hear it because if we can go into debt buying weapons, okay, if we can go and bail out banks, then we can go into debt buying housing and providing health care as well as everything else that the people need in order to thrive. On top of it, the aim is to break the cycle of social violence that is prevalent within the American society against the women. We're no longer doing the tension buildup in the violence stage. So, flowers, candies, and the restoration of Roe versus Wade in terms of claiming now it's back in the Constitution, see, that's not going to work. Because when that was taken out of the Constitution, that's when the women realized that the Constitution does not mean anything for us. Because if the Constitution was supposed to symbolize, to some extent, the protective qualities of American manhood as a collective, then they just showed us with the overturning of Roe versus Wade and the addition of 65,000 roughly R-word babies that collective American manhood means nothing. It doesn't exist. And I know there are men out here who disagree with the overturning of Roe versus Wade too. However, here's what I have to say to you, and to help you to see it from the woman's perspective and why the women are reacting the way that we collectively are. Here's the thing. When you men want something, you will storm and you will rampage to make it happen, either violently or non-violently. And no, I'm not suggesting violence in any form, FYI, and as a disclaimer. See, this overturning of Roe versus Wade made it all right for your sister or your daughter to get, or your niece, okay, your female cousin, even your mother, okay, to get R-worded, and for you to become an uncle or a grandfather to a criminal's baby who will only grow up to become a wage slave. And you see, at that point in time, you did not do enough to demonstrate that you disapprove with such a drastic move as the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Now, I know that there are those that do approve of its overturning, and they are no different than the Taliban who banned women from going to school and appearing in public. So as a result, going back to the guys that did not agree with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, but did not give a manly response against it as a collective, a lot of the women feel like you're okay with it. You know, the old adage, silence is violence. So, going back to what I was saying earlier about the switch up, when those who uphold the patriarchy want to switch it up, and they will, I strongly suggest telling them to solve the homelessness and the healthcare crisis. Also, we need to get rid of having a person indebted for life just for obtaining an education, that very same education that they'll use to work in a field that also benefits the economy. That's backwards. And it reeks. It smells rotten of like the time of the Middle Ages Europe, where in order for a person just to eat better food and learn how to read, they had to become a monk or a nun and use their lifelong labor, once educated, to benefit the church instead of themselves, similar to how wage slaves are benefiting corporations in exchange for just barely enough to survive. And with the way the average American is working right now, we're basically on the verge of serfdom. like what was common during the Middle Ages in Europe as well. But that's another topic for another time. So I told myself that I was going to keep this video brief. And on that note, that's all I have to say for now. Please be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and click on the notifications bell so that you'll know whenever I upload any new content. Take care until next time.